So let's take a first jump into this topic when we talk about the argument from design. The essential idea of the argument from design is the following: that if you look around, you're going to find a great deal of complexity and apparent designedness in the organic world around you, and that complexity and apparent designedness seems to call out for an explanation. So a little bit more precisely, the idea is that the only possible explanation of the complexity and apparent designedness in nature is that the natural world was designed by an intelligent, sentient designer. I try to put that fairly carefully in order to highlight a couple of ideas. First of all, that we're talking about the natural world being designed by an intelligent designer, not just sheer luck, for example. And secondly, the idea is that the natural world has to be explained as something that was created by a sentient designer, a creature, an entity that has some kind of awareness or consciousness or consciously formulated plans, thoughts about the future, things of that kind. That's what I mean by an intelligent, sentient designer. And it doesn't take very long to think about how a person might be very impressed by the organic world around her or him to see that there must be an explanation for this. Think about the beauty and apparent complexity in organic phenomena such as plant life or animal life. Think about how complexly beautiful the peacock's tail is. Seems like it wouldn't have just happened by chance. Seems like it calls out for an explanation. Or the human eye, incredibly complex and sophisticated as an organ for the production of vision. Seems like it calls out for an explanation of how things could have become that way. Now, a philosopher, theologian named William Paley, whose dates were 1743 to 1805, famously developed the analogy of the watch, in which he argued that if there was a watch that you came upon under certain circumstances, you'd be finding yourself thinking that it requires an explanation as well, and then he draws from that the conclusion that, by analogy, something similar must be the case with the organic world around us. So Paley was, as I mentioned, an English theologian. He was also a philosopher. He was a supporter of the American colonies during the Revolution. Unlike many of his English brethren, he was a proponent of what we now call natural philosophy, which is the idea that we should try to support the idea of the existence of a greatest conceivable being by means of reasoning as opposed to just an act of faith. And he writes in a very short essay that discusses this topic: when we come to inspect the watch, suppose you were walking in the country, he says, and you come across something that hits your shoe, you look down to see what it was, and it turns out to be a watch. And you pick it up and you examine it, and you find that it's got a seeming amount of complexity. It seems to work on its own and so forth. And he says, when we come to inspect the watch, we perceive what we could not discover in, for example, a stone right next to it, that the several parts are put together, framed for what seems like a certain purpose, namely keeping time. Now, even if you had never seen a watch at all before, or a watch like this before, you might still, as long as you have a concept of a timekeeper, be able to discern that this is a thing that does in fact keep time. And it seems like it would be very implausible that it would have just come into being that way by chance, by luck, and so you'll say there must have been some intelligent creature that designed it to do the job that it does. So here's an example of a watch, of an image of the sort that you might come across. Now, he also points out that the conclusion that we draw from the watch case does not require that we ever have seen a watch made. You might not know how watches are made. And furthermore, even if there are a couple parts within the watch that you didn't know, where you didn't know how they operated or what they did, you might still find yourself still very impressed with the overall function of the watch. And notice that you wouldn't be satisfied if somebody said, well, something had to be there, so why couldn't it just as well have been a watch like this? To which one wants to answer, well, there are lots of much more plausible alternative things that could have been there. A stone, some leaves, where we don't call for any special explanation for why they're there. Something this complex and sophisticated, however, does seem to cry out for some special explanation. So Paley goes on and discusses various aspects of the example of the watch, and he continues, writing, this mechanism being observed, the inference, we think, is inevitable, that the watch must have had a maker, that there must have existed at some time and at some place or other an artificer or artificers who formed it for the purpose which we find it actually to answer, who completely comprehended its construction and designed its use. Paley's idea is that the conclusion is irresistible, that there must have been an intelligent, sentient designer who designed and built this watch, maybe even who put it here, and that's what's necessary to explain the phenomenon before us. Paley even goes on beyond this and says, well, suppose you were to discover something even more exciting about this watch, namely that it had the capacity within itself to produce little new watches from inside. So after you spent some time with the watch, you found little, so to speak, baby watches coming out of it after a while. You'd surely be even that much more impressed with the thing than you had been before. You'd even be that much more likely to admire the contriver of this contrivance. Now, obviously, the question is, if Paley's drawing an analogy here, he's surely drawing an analogy with biological organisms, plants, animals, and so on, that seem to not only be able to perform complex tasks, but also have the capacity for reproduction. So think about things like the mitochondrion within human cells and the cells of many other animals. These are little powerhouses that store and produce energy for other parts of the cell, and they are incredibly sophisticated and complicated, incredibly effective at doing what they do. Everybody should be grateful for the mitochondria inside them and other creatures around them. And it seems like if you were to come across a mitochondrion under your microscope, you wouldn't say, oh, well, something had to be there. Why couldn't it have just as well have been this? You'd want to say, well, what explains the fact that this has the features that it does? It seems like it's got a great deal of complexity and apparent designedness that seem to call out for explanation. To say nothing of something as incredibly sophisticated and complicated as the human brain. Okay? So Paley seems like he's trying to suggest an analogy between the fecund watch on the one hand and living organisms on the other. And he concludes by writing the following. There cannot be design without a designer, contrivance without a contriver, arrangement, disposition of parts, subserviency of means to an end. These all imply the presence of intelligence and mind. Thus Paley, writing in the middle of the 18th century, concludes by, insofar as we just look around us, take note of the complexity and seeming designedness of natural phenomena around us, concludes that we have to, if we're going to account for these things, have to posit an intelligent, sentient designer in order to account for these things. And he says that being, that intelligent, sentient designer, must itself be a GCB.